So let's flash back to 1989. H.W. was in office. He had been inaugurated that January. The economy was growing and unemployment was low. We had the ongoing federal budget debate. There was increasing concern over drug use and crime. And we had foreign policy challenges, the ongoing conflict in Central America and Eastern Europe, as well as with the Soviet Union. Janet Jackson's Miss You Much was #1. You may have also been listening to Madonna. She had made the cover of Time magazine that year. New Kids on the Block were on the rise. Their album Step by Step had just come out that September. And Phil Collins seemed to balance things out. As for movies, the top movie of the year was Batman with Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson. Steamy Sea of Love was also in theaters that week. So is Lethal Weapon 2 and Gross Anatomy. But the #1 film on October 23rd was Look Who's Talking with John Travolta and Kirstie Alley. As for TV, 7:30 on weeknights, you may have tuned into Night Court. Maybe you watched Alf, Who's the Boss, or Perfect Strangers. If you were watching Monday Night Football and were rooting for the Chicago Bears, well, you would have been sorely disappointed. The Cleveland Browns beat them 27-7. If you were in Boston, well, you had a very nice October day. It was 60 to 65 in the daytime and 40 to 45 that night. So it was a very nice fall evening. Charles and Carol Stewart got married on October 13th, 1985. Charles was a cook who then went into selling fur coats, and Carol was a lawyer. The night of the crime, Charles and Carol had attended a birthing class at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Carol was 7 months pregnant at the time. Television show Rescue 911 was actually filming the night of the crime, and one of the calls they got was from Charles. "My wife's been shot. I've been shot," screamed Stewart into his cell phone as he drove through the Mission Hill area of Boston. Paramedics found that both Charles and his wife had been shot. Carol was barely alive, and Charles had a serious stomach wound. Immediately, Charles identified an African-American man in a black running suit as the perpetrator. This obviously shook up Boston quite a bit. The city was already dealing with a lot of racial tension, and people were concerned about rising crime. An editorial ran in the Globe called Death in the City. It read, "It was the most frightening crime and the least frequent. A stranger enters a family's life briefly, terrorizes, kills, and disappears. Carol's dreams of Camelot shattered. Christmas birth of baby was to cap an idyllic life." Mayor Flynn was up in arms over this. He said, "I demand the Boston Police Department continue to be extremely aggressive in cracking down on people who are using guns and killing innocent people. It's intolerable. We will use every lawful tool to support our police officers in cracking down on gun-wielding criminals." They wanted to bring back the death penalty to deter crimes like this from happening again. At the time of Carol's funeral, Charles was still in the hospital recovering from the gunshot wound, but he sent his friend with an ode to read at her funeral. It said, "Good night, sweet wife, my love. God has called you to his hands. In our souls, we must forgive the sinner because he would too." The sinner here is referring to the assailant. Detectives were fixated on finding the black perpetrator Stewart had described. The Boston police began to comb the housing projects in Mission Hill. African-American men were strip searched on the streets on any pretense. They turned Boston upside down over this. Meanwhile, Stuart was showing interest in a 22-year-old female co-worker, asking that she phone him at the hospital. There was ample evidence that Stuart was unhappy in his marriage and upset with his wife for not having an abortion. He had discussed both his obsession with the co-worker and his desire to see his wife dead with several friends and family members in the months before the murder. But the police got tunnel vision and didn't investigate thoroughly. A Black man named Alan Swanson was initially arrested and held for 3 weeks. Then Mission Hill resident Willie Bennett was arrested and held as the possible shooter. In December, Stewart had picked Bennett out of a lineup among clean-cut Boston police officers. This was the last straw for Matthew Stewart, Charles's brother, who had assisted Charles in carrying out the scheme. After Charles had shot Carol, he met up with Matthew, gave him the gun and her belongings to dispose of. In exchange for immunity, Matthew testified against his brother. In January 90, Charles found out that Matthew was going to turn him in. He fled. He drove to the Tobin Bridge and jumped to his death in the Mystic River. Willie Bennett was released after witnesses told a grand jury that the police had pressured them into identifying him. When casting a crime chart, it's important to have an exact time. So if you're dealing with a missing persons case, you would cast the chart for the last time the person was seen. If you're dealing with a crime case and there was a 911 call, you would take the timestamp of that 911 call. In this case, luckily, we do have the exact time Charles called in to 911. When looking at a crime chart, the first house in the crime chart identifies the victim. So over here, we see Gemini rising. That's the victim. That's Carol. So we say Gemini rising. Gemini is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury over here is in Libra in the 5th house of children. So that identifies Carol in this chart. And what's next to her? Mars. And Mars has to do with sharp objects, weapons. So we see here, Mercury, Carol, is next to the weapon. The first house in a crime chart gives more information about the victim, especially her body. In this crime chart, we see Jupiter, the biggest planet in the sign of Cancer, Mother. So we see in the first house that the victim is big and mother, pregnant. The 7th house identifies the perpetrator in a crime chart. It's exactly what the victim is seeing in front of her at the time. So notice we have Sagittarius on the 7th house cusp. So the 7th house identifies the perpetrator or perpetrators. We notice in this chart, we have 3 planets in the 7th house, Neptune, Saturn, and Uranus, which could mean 3 people involved. And that is likely the case. We had Charles involved, obviously, his brother Matthew, and possibly another relative. Charles's brother Michael said that Charles had spoken to him about hiring a hitman on his wife before the murder. One of these planets could be Deborah, the woman that Charles was seeing at the time, or one of them could be Matthew's friend who helped him dump Carol's possessions after the murder. In this chart, we see a very strong 3rd house. 3rd house pertains to siblings, and it also alludes to a car, and that's where the murder took place, in Charles's car. The 4th house in a crime chart reflects the end of the matter, how things end up. In this chart, we see Leo on the 4th house cusp. Then we say, okay, what planet rules Leo? The sun rules Leo. And then we look to that for more information. And the sun is at 0 degrees Scorpio, and Scorpio is death, which makes sense because everybody involved in the crime, Charles and Carol, are dead. In a crime chart, Saturn often reflects where the body is located. We know in this instance that Carol was right next to Charles, but it also shows that here in the crime chart because Saturn is placed in the 7th house, which rules the perpetrator. Carol was right next to Charles at the time of the murder. And we actually have a reliable birth chart for Charles Stewart. We know he was born on December 18th, 1959 in Boston at 5:16 a.m. So keep in mind when we go through this chart, if you share signs or planets or aspects with Charles, that obviously doesn't mean that you're a murderer. You have to take into consideration brain science and your nurturing and your spiritual evolution. So there's a lot more to criminology than just an astrology chart. So the first thing we notice when looking at Charles's chart is that he has a packed first house. The first house is the house of self. It's about one's identity and their personality. And with Charles is Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and the sun, the self is all important. With Mercury, he thinks about himself. With Mars, he takes action for himself. And with Jupiter, the largest planet, which is also the ruler of his chart because he's a Sagittarius rising, and also the sun in his first house, we have a big ego here, right? The self is all important, and there might be an overinflated sense of self-importance. In his second house, Charles had Saturn in Capricorn. Saturn is the planet of restriction and limitation, and the second house rules finances and values and self-worth. So Charles felt limited, most likely, in these ways, which is true from what we know. He was making $100K a year in 1989, which today would be $229K, not too shabby, but it's never enough, right? With his first house, which makes him almighty, this grandiosity, this overinflated sense of self-importance, there's not enough money in the world for him. There's not enough power. There's not enough clout because his ego is so enormous. So no matter how much he had, it would not be enough. With Charles's moon in Leo, in the 8th house, he may have felt entitled, Leo, to other people's resources, 8th house. The 8th house rules bequeathments, inheritances, insurance, what other people have. So he feels entitled to that, most likely, with the moon there. With Venus in Charles's 12th house, the 12th house in a chart is what's hidden to the person. So with Venus, which rules love and beauty and value, his beauty and his value may have been hidden to him. He did not see his value. He didn't see his beauty, which may account for why he committed this terrible crime. What's interesting too, Charles's moon makes a trine that's a flowing, connecting aspect to his self node at 29 Pisces. So note that 29 degrees Pisces, that's just a degree away from Aries. And Aries and Leo get along, they trine each other. So there's a flowing aspect between his moon and his self node. The moon is your emotional needs. It has to do with your subconscious and your instincts, your natural reactions to things, right? And the moon is flowing to his self node. So the self node in a chart is what we need to get away from. It's what's very easy for us. It has to do with our past lives. We need to move away from our self node, utilizing its talents to bring us toward our north node. In Charles's chart, his north node, right over here, is in Virgo and in the 10th house. So if Charles had wanted to maximize his potential, he would have worked really hard, Virgo, and made some contribution to society, the 10th house. Perhaps with this packed first house over here, he didn't feel that he should have to work that hard, right? Also, with that moon making such a flowy aspect to his self node, feeding it, there may have been a pull toward dependency, Pisces, right? Which I wondered if that was reflected by the fact that he shot himself in the stomach in this crime. It wasn't like the Diane Downs case when she shot herself in the arm after killing her kids. He shot himself in the stomach. He was severely injured, which takes a lot of guts, no pun intended. So I wonder if he did that on a subconscious level because he wanted to be taken care of, because that self node is in the 4th house of home and family. So the very, very strong, intense, emotional inner life that he had, with a lot of darkness, right? Because it's in that 8th house of death. He also had Neptune, which is deception. It can rule other things, but in this case, it could very well be deception. And it's in the 11th house, which has to do with large groups of people, the masses. And that's what Charles did. He deceived the masses by tapping into the racial tension that was going on in Boston and blaming the murder on a black guy. So with Neptune there, this is a crime against humanity. And what's super interesting is that, as we said, in a crime chart, your 7th house cusp will depict your perpetrator in the crime. In the 911 call chart, the 7th house cusp is at 25 degrees Sagittarius. And Charles's sun sign is, you guessed it, 25 degrees Sagittarius. Now, there are 12 signs in the zodiac. There are 30 degrees in each sign. So the chances of his exact sun sign and degree being on the 7th house cusp of the crime chart are pretty slim. You'll see if you're doing forensic astrology that your person of interest, their sign is usually on the 7th house cusp. Not always, but a lot of the time. So keep that in mind. If you have any thoughts, questions, or comments on the Charles Stewart case, I would love to hear what you have to say. Please put them in the comments below. Thanks so much for joining me. Hope to see you next crime.